Good afternoon, students, alumni, faculty, and staff. My name is Elena Billing, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations for the School of Sport, Tourism, and Hospitality Management. Today, I'm pleased to introduce the STHM Alumni Association's Minority Alumni Coalition. The MAC is dedicated to providing educational experiences for all STHM students from diverse perspectives. Today, the MAC's Education Committee, led by Kendra Plummer and Gabrielle Salomon, presents the Disruptor, Breaking Apart Biases in the Industry. Kendra Plummer is an STHM Class of 2013 alum. Currently, Kendra is the founding partner of Elise Capital, a hotel investment firm purposed to provide access to hotel investment opportunities, generating wealth for the firm's investors. Through the MAC, Kendra leads the Education Committee, producing a 4-part series of industry panels and webinars. Gabrielle Salomon is an STHM Class of 2016 alum. Gabrielle is currently finishing her PhD at Manchester Metropolitan University, exploring diversity, inclusion, and gender equity in professional sport. Gabrielle is also the General Manager for Chesterfield FC Women. Through the MAC, Gabby sits on the Education and Social Media Committees. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the MAC for hosting all of us. I will now turn things over to Gabby, who will introduce today's panelists.
Thanks so much, Elena, and thanks to all the STHM individuals who've helped make this a live thing today, and especially all the MAC members. So to get things started, yes, my name's Gabby, but I'm gonna leave all the talking, hopefully, to our expert panelists that we have here today. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, just their background, and we're gonna get through a little bit of an exercise before we actually get into the questions. So what I'll do is I'll let Dorsey, if you don't mind kicking it off as far as just an introduction to yourself and maybe just where you currently are, employed, and, some brief information about yourself. And then Lindsay or Jaz, one of you guys can follow from that.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Dorsey Spencer Jr. I currently serve as the Dean of Students at Colgate University. I've been in higher education for over a decade, and I'm a 07 graduate of STHM.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay McLeod. I am currently the Director of Outlets for the Higher Regency Chesapeake Bay here in Cambridge, Maryland. I am a graduate of STHM from the Tourism and Hospitality side for 2014.
Hi, everyone. I'm Melynda Link. I'm the Director of Athletic Facilities and Game Day Operations at Haverford College. I joke that my title should no longer include game day operations since we're not competing this fall, but a lot of different hats here in Division III.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jaz Daughton. I'm a graduate of STHM 2012, and I'm a travel professional. Travel has come to somewhat of a halt during this COVID time period. So I formerly worked at Rhodes Scholar, and as I searched for a job, I have a YouTube series called Black Gems Unearthed, where I'm sharing Black history around Massachusetts.
Great. So thanks everybody for being here again today. I really appreciate, we're gonna have a great conversation as far as what bias looks like in each of your workplaces and your experiences with it. For those of you who are joining who maybe aren't so sure about bias, that's completely okay, whether you're an expert or maybe this is your first time talking about it. This is really a space for you just to really open up your mind to what really you might not realize, or things that maybe just you haven't thought were an issue until maybe you hear from somebody expressing these. I wanted to start with just this quote that I found as far as just talking about bias, and this is a sports industry specific, however, I think it can be used in a lot of disciplines. Cultural competence, anti-racism, and social justice work are not badges we earn and hold on to for the rest of our lives. They are muscles we repeatedly have to flex and work on, or they go away. We know as far as why everybody here is probably at university within Temple or had gone and studied, you know that once you finish high school, it's not education that you just have that for the rest of your life and you're an expert. You have to continue learning. And that's just part of, I guess, being of your bias, is understanding that social constructions of how we see the world, unfortunately, can lead to a lot of terrible things for groups of individuals that hasn't been set up for, as far as making sure the world has equal offerings. So I just want to put that out there and make sure that even if you're coming to this conversation today, whether you're an expert and you actually are maybe working at Temple as a staff member yourself, or if you're a freshman and this is your first time talking about this subject, we all have room for the development inside of this conversation. And I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your questions later on as well. So for the panelists, what we're going to ask, just to kind of share some housekeeping as far as questions, we do have a Q&A box. I do have access to this box, I believe, as far as within my settings. So what I'm going to do is save them for the very end, but feel free just to say your name, or if there's directed questions at specific individuals, I'm sure that our panelists will be more than happy to answer them. So starting off very broadly, we'll start, I guess, with Melynda. Would you mind sharing, what do you think bias looks like within your industry, and then open up the floor for everyone else?
Thanks, Gabby. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here today. For me, I'm a woman working in Division III facilities. So the athletic industry in general is very male dominated, but facilities is, 10, 15, 20 times even more male dominated. So I actually did both of my Temple internships in facilities and events. And then I had a graduate assistant position as well. So I haven't been in a type of the industry that's not male dominated. So for me, having a strong personality has helped. It's probably also why I'm still working in facilities and events. But I think sometimes it looks like women aren't tough, women aren't competitive, so they don't deserve these roles. But to me, women bring a lot to the table. And so it's important to have different personalities in the room, but also different levels of intersectionality in the room. And so the old boys club is getting dismantled in the sports industry in a lot of ways. One really strong example was this past weekend, the NFL, we had 2 female assistant coaches and a referee in the same game. Like, that's groundbreaking. And so I know that future generations won't feel as male dominated as it currently is, and I look forward to that day, but it's definitely a male dynamic that we have to be a part of right now.
Piggybacking off of that, I would say for myself, I am in hotels, and we definitely see things sometimes with the male and female perspective of it. I remember when I first started, the first thing people would always ask me, being a young female, was, oh, well, do you want to go into HR when you're older? When do you want to go just into sales or events? But I was operations through and through. I have worked in restaurants for countless years, and it was always seen as almost a hidden thing that for females, they wouldn't necessarily strive to be the director of operations or the director of rooms, director of food and beverage. It was only just, they would just only go to HR, and then they would, so that way they can have that family atmosphere, because people constantly would talk to us about that was, oh, if you work in the hotel, there's a lot of crazy hours. Are you going to be able to do this on the side? And that was something for me that I would always see, that I'm ready to make this my career focus. And similar to Melynda, having that strong personality, you wanted to make it as focused as you possibly can, and always wanting to strive for more. So I completely see where we would see the biases sometimes of only doing so much, so that way you can do this as like a side thing. But for me, it was always to make it the primary goal and the primary of what I wanted to do.
I can go ahead. So my career experience thus far has been in arts and culture for nonprofits, and also in the tourism and travel space, creating tour itineraries primarily. And I think the big thing for me, what I've seen, is just the narratives that are told are not diverse. We primarily see in the tourism industry a white, European, often male story told, and many companies do not challenge the narrative. That's just the way it is. The stories we tell are the same stories that we've told for decades and decades and centuries. And so I have tried to challenge those stories. Like, why can't we expand it? Why can't we talk about people that are LGBTQI? Why can't we tell Black stories? Why can't we tell Latinx stories? In the arts and culture field, I found that at times there could be a bit of anti-Blackness, meaning people did not want to include Black people perhaps in the content that was shared, or perhaps also in the actual workspace. They might not be inviting and welcoming to them. So I found some challenges kind of through the pipeline from the actual workplace to the product that is put out there in arts and culture and travel and tourism. Pardon the train, you're going to hear it a few times. It's right across from where I live. So I'll conclude there.
This is Dorsey. Higher education by its very nature is biased, right? So a college or university by its very nature in the creation of those institutions were meant to select some people to be educated and some people not to be educated, right? So it is actually in the infrastructure of higher education. And you see that in a variety of ways, right? You see that in standardized tests, which a lot of institutions have started to move away from, but that's a way of showing bias, right? You see it in people complaining about affirmative action, but not complaining about legacy admits, right? So you're letting people in based off of their connection. That's a form of bias, right? You see it in the lack of leadership roles for people of color and women, right? Temple was, at least when I was there, was one of the most diverse institutions in the country, and we still have not had a Black president, right? Of the institution, I mean. I have never worked at an institution with a Black president. Even when I worked in Nigeria, the president was a white woman, right? To give you an idea of some of the biases. But then it breaks it down to what I deal with on a day-to-day, the student experience, right? So there's tons of bias within the student experience. So you think of a lot of your students of color in particular going through microaggressions, right? Where little things that people say and do that really cut deep to them, but they have to just endure it in many cases, right? And I think of, in many cases, that shows up with our student athletes, right? Which a lot of times are students of color, and them having to deal with different microaggressions from faculty, staff, and students. Our first generation low income students, right? And some of the challenges that they face in that space. And some institutions do not have specific departments or offices that work with that population. I think about international students, right? And all the different policies that have been put in place over the last few years that affect them, right? There was a point where we were scrambling to see if we could even serve our international students because of a policy change, right? Our undocumented students, right? So higher education is generally conscious of some of the biases it has, but has not always been the most innovative in addressing those challenges, right? There's still an old boys club for college presidents. There's still, if you look at most institutions, advancement. So the people who raise the money for most institutions, they're not usually people of color. They're rarely actually people of color, to be honest with you. It's in our faculty tenure, right? So the faculty that get tenure and promotion, it shows up there. So higher education is a product of bias in this country.
Great. I want to tap into there, actually, kind of expanding on further with the microaggressions, because Jaz, you were speaking earlier before the session started, obviously, kind of as far as talking about women of color and how that can be conversations of physical features like a hair change or, just getting things, that in the bias of somebody's mind, they might not think that it's being something that's offensive, but it actually really is. Maybe talk us through something a little bit more specifically on maybe if you've experienced that or what it looks like in the industry today.
Sure. Boston's a particularly weird place when it comes to microaggressions. They're like really sophisticated up here about it. You don't always know, like, is that a microaggression or is it about me personally? I know I worked in retail for a few years and I never could figure out, like, do people not like me, the person, or is it me, the African-American woman that's in this business? So, I mean, there's microaggressions from not having people pay attention to you when you're in a meeting and you're supposed to be the one that is presenting the material, to being overlooked when someone is walking down a hallway, to only being addressed based off of the hairstyle that you have. Yes, I know I have fabulous hair, but there's other things that I'm trying to share that are very important. So there's definitely some challenges that I've experienced as a Black woman, and I'm sure that there are others in people in other parts of the industry and in other parts of the country that have experienced it. But I can say, particularly here in Boston, I have found it very confusing to know what is going on.
I'll go back to Melynda and Lindsay. It'd be great for you to probably talk on the tourism side and hospitality side with the boys club reference, as far as being a woman who obviously entered that industry or that area knowing that you were going to be challenged with these barriers, we'll refer to them as. from your understanding, how do you feel that your perception of the bias, is it the exact same of what you thought it would be when you were doing internships? And is it maybe changed more with getting experience, or maybe for our students that are looking to enter these places, how does it get better?
Yeah, you can go, Lindsay.
Okay, I was like, so I think mine has definitely changed just throughout the years. I think when I went into it, I went in very naively, and I was thinking, yeah, this is going to be great. Everyone's going to be so nice to each other, and we're in hospitality. That means that we're so nice to everyone else, right? That means everyone's going to be nice to us. And it definitely switched a little bit through the years. I would say for me, I've worked at several different hotel locations, and they obviously change based off if it's more of a corporate side or family resort type. And I could see just different biases at each one of those. It's different things at each place. But in regards to what we were talking about with the Old Boys Club, that was one of the first terms that I heard when I first stepped in out of my internship and I was full-fledged into the career. And the thing that struck me about it was that everyone was okay with it. And people would say, it's an old boys, it's a boys club, don't worry about it. And that's what kind of tweaked my thoughts toward it, because I was thinking, okay, why would you say, it's a boys club, but don't worry about it? And for me as a female and a young female going into it, I just knew that I wanted to learn more, first off. And I think getting that education and figuring out why would this be the okay and the norm, and why aren't we necessarily changing with the times, especially with how fast and quickly the hotel industry changes. We should be more open and trying to change with everything that's going on with it. And as far as with how it, for myself, it adapted, every place that I've gone, I've seen it in a different way. And for me now, luckily, because I've worked at so many places and getting that experience, I know what I'm tackling in each spot. So if I can see that right away, I know I'm not going to just stand down from it. Whereas when I first started, that's how everyone kind of told me, just stand down, it's fine. And that's when I realized I am the disruptor, because I wanted to make that change. And that's where I was thinking, okay, if you're saying it's okay, it clearly shouldn't be, if that's why everyone is starting to see this. And then I think the biggest part is just getting other people involved and asking those questions. Because that for myself is, I got to gain a lot of mentors and I got to have these discussions with them. And that's where I realized, okay, I'm not the only one thinking this. I'm not going crazy. And that means we've got to make this change happen. And that way it's not just an old boys club anymore, and it's got a little bit more diversity to it.
Yeah, just jumping off of that. So I think things are changing. And so I do think it's a generational thing. At my previous institution, I was pretty silent in the beginning, just trying to learn the job and do the job really well. And I kind of always thought that my work ethic and the product that I produced would speak for itself. And I learned that that was not always the case. So, my first year, I knew there were personality conflicts, just the fact of a strong woman's voice was not generally accepted. And so it took until I was not being compensated based on what I was told in my interview for me to really speak up. And I'll tell you, the next year was really uncomfortable for me. I went through a lot in that position because I chose to speak up, but I know that in my current position and in any future positions that I'm going to be better off. And I know that I'm going to treat people better based on what I went through, even though it was really challenging at the time. But I think just like you have to gain respect by doing your job really well, or else anything you have to say is not going to matter. And so at the end of the day, those people may have not liked my personality, but they would have never been able to be like, well, she doesn't work hard, or she doesn't know what she's doing at a certain sporting event, or whatever it may be. So I still think it's really important to work really hard, but understand that that's not the only thing that matters in a workplace.
Absolutely. I can say that I'm experiencing those things in my role with Chesterfield FC Women, which is a soccer club over here. We have a great group of individuals who've run the club, but as a only female voice and being a member of the LGBT community, I'm seen as the version of diversity in the club, which is something that needs heavily addressed. And I'm trying my best to be the disruptor in that environment. And Can completely agree as far as, you know, it is your work ethic is you could do all of that you want, but then getting your voice at that table and actually being heard is a whole process of its own. So thanks for that. So Dorsey, we're going to come back to you with this one. So what does being a disruptor personally mean to you? And you can probably talk in your personal life, maybe for friends and family, as well as then go about your colleagues in your workplace.
So I'll start with, I guess, colleagues and workplace. It's usually a little bit easier that way for me. So my role is specifically here, my role is to oversee the out of the classroom experience for students, right? So particularly their involvement and their engagement. So I directly oversee multicultural affairs or LGBT plus initiatives, spiritual life, some of the things that are more connected to one's identity. So for us, being a disruptor here is speaking up a lot of times, right? And being that voice of disruption, really, because I mean it's one of those things where it can be very challenging, especially if you're the only person doing it, right? Especially being a person of color who's doing it, and that's how you get to things like racial battle fatigue and all these different things, because you're generally the one that has to bring up those things because people think it's normal. As you said, like that's the norm, right? So this is just how we've done things. This institution has existed for 200, 300 years, right? So it's one of those things where you're constantly having to speak up. You're constantly having to, in some cases, check your privilege, right? So for me, in that case, that might be when it comes to sexual violence, right? As a male, that's certain thing that I need to sit down and support or be an ally for our women for, right? It's not something that I necessarily would, in general, right? In general terms, would be at the forefront for me. But racial issues, ethnic issues, issues of socioeconomic class and food insecurity, all those things are things where we're like, hey, we got to do something about this. To give you a great example from my job, we're in person. So our institution is actually in person this semester. And one of the things that you can't do here, because we're trying to maintain a bubble for the COVID, not to spread the virus, is that you can't leave the town. You can't leave the village, essentially. Otherwise, there's some trouble for that. So you have to stay within the city limits. But we're in a very rural part of central New York. So if you're a student of color, how are you supposed to do your hair, get barbers, all those different things, right? So when they put those policies in place, that wasn't thought of. That wasn't a concern for anyone, right? Because they could get their hair done, or they were, didn't really care about their hair, right? But our students generally would either do each other's hair, or they would travel about an hour to 45 minutes away to get their hair done or cut, or they would go home and do it there. They can't do any of those things technically right now, right? So having to be the person of, hey, this has come up. We really need to figure out how we're going to address this, right? That's how in my capacity as Dean of Students, I'm more of the cheerleader and advocate for students, especially those who are marginalized, regardless of what that identity is. In my personal life, it's definitely ebb and flow, right? Because in my family, right, sometimes there are many things, especially around racial issues, where they're very upfront and can be very progressive. And then there's some issues potentially around gender or sexuality, or where they might be a little bit more conservative, and having to be able to speak up for people in general, but also family members that are part of those marginalized identities. Sometimes it shows up with, like, your past teachers or friends you grew up with, right? I grew up in Long Island, and that's a very segregated part of the country. And sometimes when you see stuff that people say online, and you just have to say something, right? Because the way of thinking or their approach to things is just not, it's just not forward thinking. It denies the humanity of people. And I think that's a theme across both aspects of my life, right? How do I uplift the humanity of all people, regardless of who they are and what they, what their backgrounds are? How do I do that in a higher education setting, but also in a personal setting?
So who I will say, Lindsay, can you follow up on that?
Sorry. I completely agree with what he's talking about. I think just in the basic sense of it, being a disruptor is just constantly changing with the times. We think about what used to be okay 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and things are completely different now. And I think it's so great that these movements are happening, because it's finally giving people a voice that not necessarily they got just not that long ago. And I think for myself and trying to be a disruptor is, I am trying to be that voice and be that guide to the people that I am directly managing or helping out with. The one thing I did love about my company with Hyatt is when you start as an intern, you automatically get set up into like a mentorship program, and you get to pick who your mentors are. And I was lucky enough, I picked some great mentors and I've worked with them throughout the years, and I've been able to lean on them through these things. And I've talked to them about biases that I see, and that's how you gain these relationships. And then my turning point absolutely was when I was chosen to be a mentor for a CMT or corporate management trainee. And they brought up to me how they were feeling discriminated against because they were in the LGBT community, and they were confused on why people were constantly asking them about it, or things that didn't necessarily matter toward their work ethic. Back to what Melynda was saying, they weren't necessarily thinking just about the work ethic or what they're getting done, but instead of what they look like and why did they change their hair that day and little things like that. So for me, I think the biggest thing is just working on being better with yourself and getting that education that you need to know how to disrupt in the right way. Because if you're not going to get yourself educated on it, no one will want to listen to your voice and hear what you're saying. And I think that's so important that for myself, especially in the last few months, like what we learned with COVID and the Black Lives Matter, I wanted to make sure that I was getting my education and I was checking my privilege and doing these things that you don't think about sometimes in the daily. And I thought it was so great that they were finally getting forced to learn it. And that way it was fully brought up. And that's how I knew, okay, I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to change this. And I wanted to make sure that others were heard. And I made sure it was in a comfortable way, but obviously making sure that people are listening and having those conversations with these mentors and mentees. So then that way it's getting on a broader horizon and more people are learning about it. So I think that's just been the biggest thing for myself is how can we change in the proper way and doing it in the best way possible.
Yeah, I think for me, I always want to leave my job better than I found it. And I'm lucky that I came into a job that a person was here for 9 years before me, but they hired somebody 8 years younger than him at the time. And so I had to be trusted in this job, but I also didn't want to keep everything the same as how he had done it. And I think it's important to, spend a certain amount of time learning, but then you also have to be ready and willing to speak up on what needs to change. The saying that's how we've always done it is the least favorite sentence in my vocabulary, because at my previous institution, that was all that I heard. And so here I tried really hard to say, okay, well, have we looked at it from this angle as well? And maybe my idea is not the best one, and I'm not saying it is, but I at least want to explore the conversation. And so for me, I want to do a really good job so that the next time, I'm eventually going to outgrow this position. The next time they go to hire somebody, did they have a good experience with me as a female in facilities, as a young female, and as just somebody as a part of this community, because Haverford is a really different community. And so making sure that the type of personality that I had, was that able to fit in here? When we have events meetings across campus, I'm one of very few women, which we have a female president, we have a female provost, our athletic director is female, but in certain meetings, I'm still one of the very, very few women. And so I always just wanted to leave a good impression so that there's a better impression of women in higher roles. So to me, it's more like almost an ego thing by doing a good job in that disruptor role.
I'd love to add on to what you just said there, specifically about that's the way it's always been done. Fortunately, the tour travel company I was working for, they did not exactly believe in that statement. I remember at one point, one of the VPs, she said, no sacred cows, which meant we're not going to do things the same way over and over again. We have to be innovative and think about things differently. So I kind of took it upon myself to question things. For example, like tour itineraries. Why don't we have content that talks about the Native people throughout the United States of America? Because they were here first. So whenever there were new programs created, I would specifically look into the Native nations and figure out what group was here. Are they still here? And who could speak on it? And I also looked at questioning who are our tour guides? Why are there our tour guides? And should we be looking at people that can be more representative of the location that our tour itineraries are in? And other people would question things too like this, although I kind of was a bit more adamant about it until I could get an answer of why not. And I think the industry as a whole, the travel industry doesn't have a lot of good representation because it's a field where there's a lot of white women, to be honest, that are tour guides, a lot of women that are retired teachers. And I think it's just a matter of needing to tell people that there are these types of opportunities. Additionally, oftentimes with travel and tourism, the expectation is that you have experience traveling. And traveling is a luxury. Not everyone has money to go travel around the world to be able to get into the industry. So I've been on a few different diversity calls where they've talked about how can we get around this issue. I haven't heard a solution yet, but at least people are now talking about it. And then I also question the marketing, the different catalogs and print pieces and online. Why is it all just white people that are featured? Why aren't there people reflecting all the different complexions that are out there, or 2 females, 2 males, or people that may not look like a specific gender? Why is that? So really questioning is what I think makes someone a disruptor.
Thanks for that, Jaz. I think the key point actually that everybody has said in some way, you might have not directly shared it, is just around taking into account your privilege and using it to make a level playing field, if you will, for every kind of individual that maybe doesn't have access to those materials to do so. And I was trying to think earlier of a really good example of how you can make people from Temple check that kind of privilege in a unique way that everybody could think about this. And my best case scenario was, I was thinking crossing Broad Street back in, this was 2015 for me. Next time anybody, maybe students or staff here wise, if you just look at the individuals passing you and starting to think to yourself around their experiences, do they have the same resources that you do? Are you living off campus? If they're a commuter, I never really thought too much about when I was privileged enough to be able to live on campus during those times, and how that really sets you up for success. And if you are somebody like myself who was able to do those things, using your space now in whether you're in full-time employment or in internships, to really explore that, to see, you know, how much have you really been given as you know, somebody in your life to be privileged, as we said. So no, that was a really key point to also take away. And another element which Melynda talked on was being not just a woman, but a woman of a younger age. I can attest this, you know, being of a woman in a general manager position and being under the age of 30, the conversations that I have with a lot of the individuals in specifically soccer over here, the average age of a coaching staff is probably anywhere between 35 to 50, and white males, white straight males. And it's really hard to kind of get that relationship in place of coming from 2 different cultures, one being American, but it's something that you really need to kind of take into perspective. And I'm really glad she said that. And you might have learned about this in a few of your classes if you're at Temple now and undergrad, intersectional kind of theory and how that relates to what we'll call as a characteristic. So if you're LGBT or if you're a woman, I'm not going to go in depth because you'll know these things. But then if you have another layer to you, a woman in sport or a woman of sport who is of color experiences it twice or 3 times as hard as a woman who's white. And that's just things that we need to kind of keep in the back of our heads. So great. Thanks so much, everybody, for answering that one. Our next one, which I'll go back to Melynda, if you don't mind opening us up on, what roles do others have to support disruptors or to make themselves become one?
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts on this one. My first being that we have to be open to change. And so if the people around you are not open to change, then they're not going to become a disruptor themselves. And so if that's the case, then we have to meet people where they are. And especially with everything with the pandemic and anti-Black racism, for me, it's about planting seeds. And so I'm constantly trying to meet people where they are and plant a small seed. And so maybe not in the next 6 months, somebody will speak up a little bit more, but maybe next year. And one good example is, are you speaking up at the Thanksgiving dinner table? So I lead facilitation for LGBTQ inclusion here. It was made for administrators, but we've translated it to a student program. And so the conversations I'm having with my students who come from literally all across the country is, you may have come from a place that is very conservative or doesn't even talk about these issues or just have these conversations. And so maybe this year you don't go full blown, you're a terrible person, but maybe you make a comment where you wouldn't have made a comment in the past. And I think, yes, you need to have support, but you need to also just practice doing that. And so doing it in a more comfortable space, maybe, which is Haverford's campus is a really good community. So you're supposed to call people out as a part of like our honor code. And so maybe you do it in a more comfortable situation here so that when you do go home at Thanksgiving, you're able to speak up a little bit more. But I think the other thing is just educating yourself. And so you can't be an expert in everything, but if something's a passion to you, you still need to continue to invest in yourself. And so I think Lindsay talked about it being in a mentorship program. So I'm always joining every mentorship program. It doesn't matter how many years in the industry I get, there's always going to be somebody with more experience than me who has something to teach me. And then lastly, I think it's important to speak up every time. So whether you are really aggressive in the knowledge you have to back yourself up, or if you just, say, oh, that's not really right, something like that, just speaking, especially to microaggressions, somebody may not even realize. And so it's important to speak up every time.
Great. How about, we'll go Jaz. Can you maybe give your thoughts on this?
Sure. I think in the working world, it's important to have allies. So people who have similar thoughts of wanting social justice. So in my realm of tourism, like the content that we're creating and the marketing and even the people that we're hiring. So I fortunately was able to find a group of people that were of the similar mindset that there should be equality in the organization, so that when there were issues that there were different people that could bring up problems. So it wasn't the same person that was always being that squeaky wheel. From asking HR why we couldn't have a specific feminine hygiene drive. They did not particularly care for the way that we framed it. And so we had one person who had not frequently contacted HR with questions approach them, rather than another person that was on the radar for always being a disruptor. So I think allyship is very important, so that you have different people that can speak on your behalf. I think another example is that I know sometimes Asian colleagues that have names that are not American names, so challenging to pronounce, you'll hear people continuously pronounce their name wrong, and they don't want to have to make that person uncomfortable because they're saying their name wrong. So it's great in that scenario when there's someone that's your colleague that can say, hey, that's not the way to say their name. Can you please take some time and learn it? So things like that are reasons why I think having people who can speak up is very important. And it's not just you, and trying to recruit people too to become allies, just to kind of have conversations and see where they're at so far and kind of nudge them along.
Is it Dorsey or Lindsay? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think for me, I agree with what has already been said. I think the education piece is very important, right? Because I think a lot of times people rely on their experience to understand the world, right? And not understanding the perspectives and experiences of other people. And I think that gets people in general in a lot of trouble, right? The idea that you really cannot empathize with other people or your peers and what they might be going through in different settings or the struggles. I think the ways that you can support are amplifying people's voices, right? To say who is not at this table, right? If you're in a position of power or a position to make change, whose voices are not heard here, and how can we get them here, or how can I convey those messages on their behalf if I can't get them here. I think another part of it is that I think people really struggle with is the idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, right? You have to be okay with being uncomfortable. A lot of these conversations that you have to have as a disruptor are very uncomfortable for people, both for you as the person who has to bring them up and the person who has to deal with who's on the receiving end of it most times, right? So you have to be okay with being uncomfortable, right? You have to be okay with, as an ally or a person who's going to support a disruptor, you have to be okay with getting things wrong, right? There are going to be times where you say things and do things that are wrong, and that it's okay when a person checks you on doing those things wrong. It should be, as Brene Brown says, you're here to get it right, not be right, right? So the idea of you're really there to elevate people, to push people forward, you're going to make mistakes, right? It's inevitable, right? Because you're learning, you're growing the same way you learn and develop anything else. you're going to drop the ball occasionally. So I think those are the key things: being okay with being uncomfortable, but also acknowledging that you're going to, being comfortable with being wrong. I think sometimes what hinders a lot of people from doing this work is that they are afraid of being wrong, or they don't want to look foolish, or they're afraid they're going to be called racist or sexist or a bigot or xenophobic, right? So they just will step back, right? And if you had a chance to read How to Be an Anti-Racist, he blatantly tells you that's not really a stance you can take, right? You can't be not whatever, right? You can't be not racist or not sexist, right? It's the idea that you are either actively pursuing, right, policies and procedures and practices that are anti fill in the blank, or you're not. And by not doing it, you're actually perpetuating the system because you're benefiting from that system more than likely, right? So I think those are the key things that individuals who want to support disruptors can do to do so.
I just want to throw out there, just with the COVID time we're living in right now, there are so many free webinars and resources that are being offered now that are not typically accessible or free. And so, like, Dorsey just named a few books, but there's also so many, professional organizations that are offering opportunities more widely than typically. And so definitely take advantage of those right now. I know I'm signed up for 3 straight weeks of different conventions, and I would have only been able to go to one of them in a regular year. And so use this time, albeit for some people it's way busier, some people it's just way different, but take the time when you have it to really educate yourself and take advantage.
Yeah, and I was just going to piggyback on basically what everyone has already said. I completely agree with it. I just think definitely the education aspect has been so important. I apologize for my dog. But it's so important that they need to get that out there. And I have also been joining in with COVID and making sure that I am getting those resources. So what Melynda said, I signed up for a couple of myself, and I've used different resources like LinkedIn and seeing them on there and getting those networking tools so you could actually learn more about it. And just going back again, I really do think one of the biggest roles is don't ever be afraid to say even the smallest thing. And that was one of the toughest things that I had to learn at a young age was it okay if I brought something else up in a meeting when it's all the bosses or something like that? If I didn't necessarily understand, or simply asking a question, sometimes you would be nervous or things would come up. And I think that was the biggest thing that I have taught others, is never be afraid to ask those questions. If something's on your mind, bring it up, because someone else is also thinking it, and it could be brought up, and then it can also bring into a new different of a conversation. If you can steer the conversation in a way that makes people think differently, that's where it's going to make the big things happen. So I completely agree. I think the smallest things some people think are too small, but they really aren't. And that's where it all needs to stem from.
Can I piggyback off of what Lindsay just said? I love the idea of not being afraid to speak up, but I'm 100% afraid to speak up. So the strategy that I have used, like usually when I'm uncomfortable, I will literally count in my head to 3, and then I will say something like I'm jumping into a pool, because otherwise I will just wait for it. And then the meeting's over. I didn't say what I needed to say. So if you're like me and you're afraid, like maybe that will help some of you out there.
I love that example, because I've definitely counted in my head 3 or 5 as well.
I love how everybody's made the point of using this time wisely. I am going to be the perfect example of this. I was doing my LinkedIn homework on everybody before this call, and Dorsey has certifications in diversity, equality, inclusion work, which I doing my PhD, that's obviously on the academic sphere, and I'm always interested. So I can be your little guinea pig there to kind of say, yes, that is definitely the route to go in these things. No, but thanks guys for answering all those things. One point also make out is that when we talk about obviously the roles, and obviously you can have a disruptor and then you can have a support system, it's really important to recognize that growing that team can make a bigger disruption. And feel free, obviously, from these conversations to kind of think in your own spaces. If it's a classroom setting, it might be that Thanksgiving dinner setting that Melynda shared. It doesn't have to be just in the professional workspace. I know that, especially right now at given where you're from in the United States, given with tonight's obviously debate, that's 2 sides of the spectrum. And it's just something along the lines of, if conversations are obviously something that maybe you don't think are appropriate or, you know, as respectful to a group of individuals, put yourself out there, but don't do it in a way that's obviously confrontational. Think about the best way to do it. And Jaz's example, the 3 seconds, that sounds amazing. I'm probably going to pick that up myself. So thanks for that. So our last structured question before reminder, just if you have any questions, throw in the Q&A. Kendra, I actually don't have access to that. So when we're done these questions, I'm probably going to leave it to you to actually do. So I said I wouldn't have her on the camera to do things, but I'm actually getting her on. So question here is, what advice do you have for someone in a workspace that is lacking diversity and needs a disruptor urgently? And we'll go with Lindsay. Could you open this one?
So I know this has been said before, but I truly, truly believe that having that mentorship and those allies is the easiest way to get this started. I know that in my personal experiences from this, that is how I've gotten it started and gotten future change within a hotel or within just a team itself. But I will say that once I was able to, you know, take that leap of faith and ask that first question and kind of hold my breath until I get that answer, that's when I truly noticed that I can make that change by just simply opening my mouth. And I know we all said it's scary and it's frightening, especially when this was back years ago. So I was a young female in, you know, a dog-eat-dog world or however you want to call it. But I think just getting those allies and getting that support system so you can have that back, and just like what Dorsey was saying, so that way you can elevate each other and have that voice for one another. I know that once I got my questions answered, that only made me more hungry in a sense, and it made me more trying to strive to help others. So when I had that mentee of mine come and ask me questions about why people were asking about her background rather than just her work ethic, I started brainstorming, like, let me think of ideas. What can we do? How can we change this? Let me think of some of the people that I can use on my ally team to help you as well, and kind of growing in numbers. And I think that's just the biggest piece of advice that I can say that has worked for me personally, is getting those allies and getting that team together, that core trust, the ones that have the same values, so that way it can be more streamlined for the future of it.
I think for me, one of the most powerful tools for a person who is acknowledging that there's a lack of diversity or inclusion or equity in their space is the word why, right? When you start to ask people why, they get nervous, right? Because they have to explain why certain things aren't the way that they are. So if you are in a meeting and you're like, why are there no women at this meeting? Why are there no people of color at this meeting, right? That starts to make people pay attention a little bit more. And you might get excuses like the CEO of what bank was it? A bank recently that said, oh no, there's no black people that qualify for these jobs. And it's like, that's highly unlikely, right? Black people are the most educated they've probably ever been in history, right? So there's no way you can make the excuse that, oh no, sorry, there's no black people. It means that you haven't put the work in, right? And that's the case with most industries, right? That there are people who can do the job. We just don't put the work in to find those people. We don't market in the right places. We don't intentionally create pipelines, right, to help. We don't develop or mentor, as Lindsay said, we don't mentor people of color or women or what have you into those spaces, right? But I think for those who are just getting started, asking why is really important. I think it's also important to understand the difference between diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Because I think sometimes people kind of conflate all those things together, and they use that as an example of like, oh, well, we have a black guy, right? And it's like, but what does that mean? Like, that doesn't mean anything in this setting, right? So, I mean, essentially, diversity is just numbers, right? It's just quantitative, right? You have this many women, you have this many people of color, you have this many, so on and so forth, right? Equity is more of a choice, right? You're choosing to actually make things equitable, right? And then inclusion is action, right? You have to work to make sure that your environment is actually a space where everyone feels welcome, where everyone feels they have a voice, where everyone feels that they're equal and their value to the organization is equal to everyone else's, right? But those are things you have to work at and understand. Like, you can't just say, oh no, we are diverse, because, you know, I've seen where people will say, oh, we're diverse, and the person that they're referring to is like the custodian, right? They have people, and there's no person that makes any decisions that's a person of color or from a marginalized background, right? No women, and so on and so forth. But I think those are the two things I would recommend, is asking why, and then really understanding what diversity, equity, and inclusion actually mean, and then what does that mean in the context of your organization.
Melynda or Jaz, who wants to go?
I'll go. I think there's a few things that I've said already today that I think are really important to reiterate. So just doing your job really well, because nobody will take you seriously as a disruptor if you're not doing your job well. And then this conversation about allies, I think it's also important to have allies outside of your circle. And so for me, that's having allies across campus. And so, you know, my best work friend is in facilities, and I know if I have a random need, he's somebody that I can, you know, count on. And so finding voices across campus for somebody that works at an institution is important, because it also kind of gives you the pull that you need if you're trying to, you know, upset the system. I also just think, like, in general, it's about speaking up. And I'm actually really not confrontational person, but these issues impact me and the people I love. And so I'm just very passionate about it. And so understanding that having passion and having action are different. And so you can't just care about it. You have to be willing to speak up. So it's definitely a confidence thing, and it comes with practice, as I talked about earlier as well. But if they fire you for calling out their diversity, you probably will win a lawsuit. So it doesn't hurt to try, if you ask me.
Wow, you guys said it all. I'm trying to think, what else is there? I guess I would add, like, in the workplace, like with building allies, it's back when we could be in person, it was helpful for me to have conversations like at the water cooler to get to know people, or like invite someone out for coffee to get to know them. So I'm trying to figure out how to reinvent that via Zoom in order to get to know people and see if there's some synergy, and if I can bring them onto the side of diversity and inclusion. I mean, maybe it is just a matter of having a Zoom call and asking them to have their favorite tea and you have your drink together on the call. I don't know, but I think trying to find out who has synergy with you so that you can work together, and continuing your education too, because there's just so much to diversity. And I don't think anyone has mentioned anything about people that have certain disabilities. Like, do you see them in your workplace? Why don't you see them in your workplace? Do you know much about them? Like, continuing to learn areas that you might not be familiar with.
Great. I think, and Melynda, with that passion action thing, it's really interesting, because I think when you're talking about the individuals who maybe are the barriers or the reason why you're lacking diversity, so that could be anywhere at the very top with your hiring managers or CEOs or CFOs, but how do you turn the real way that you get them, how do you turn that into their passion? Because that's really how you're going to see action holistically throughout an organization, right? And I guess kind of my last point here before we open up to the rest of the group here, and if anybody wants to chime in on this, it really is about how you approach these topics in a way that you're making a point to be intentional. Dorsey talked on that earlier. You need to be intentional with things. I can give an example with certain organizations reaching out to community groups that aren't always a part of that. For instance, soccer over here is traditionally a white male sport, and I know that there's community groups for refugees and individuals, because the UK has a lot of those groups come over here. And how to be intentional as a community football club is to make sure you're reaching out and being as inclusive, bringing them in, not just having a one-off or having things repeated on. So I can definitely see the value in that, and I really appreciate those points. Is there any last minute things from these questions that any of the panelists would like to make before we open it up for questions?
I just wanted to expand on Dorsey saying about asking why. Sometimes you have to ask why to a second and third degree. And so if the question is, why don't we have a more diverse student body? And they say they don't apply. Well, why don't they apply? And so digging deep, like, to me, it's always about 3 whys, and at least, if not more, but definitely asking why is important. But don't settle for an answer that doesn't actually get you to a solution.
So thank you to our panelists. We do have quite a few questions in just a few minutes, so I want to make sure that we get all of our questions in here. So our first question is actually specifically for Dr. Dorsey. And our viewer says that I have played lacrosse for my entire life, and I have witnessed many Long Island parents attack the referees with harmful comments. I was wondering, how would you recommend being a disruptor to aggressive Long Island parents in a field setting like a lacrosse match?
So that's a great question. I've also witnessed this. I guess it's a trade of being from Long Island. It's one of those situations where you have to weigh your pros versus cons, right? Is it in the best interest to address that person about that behavior in that moment, right? Or if there's an opportunity for violence, right? Are you willing to be in that situation, right? That's a personal decision you have to make in that scenario, right? Should you protect the person that's being attacked or harassed or call all kinds of different things? I think so, right? But you have to also decide on how they approach that, right? And I think that's where you start to get into bystander intervention, right? The idea of what step works best for you. And bystander intervention can be used in an array of situations. So, right, is it better to distract? Right, to distract the person from that situation? Is it better to refer? Do you need to call police or some kind of security or something, right? Or is it direct? And that's where you are, hey, get out of this person's face, or you need to stop saying that to this person, X, Y, and Z. I think you need to be armed and prepare yourself to have those kind of conversations, especially if that's a norm for you, right? To be able to engage with that. And in some cases, it's also maybe encouraging the referees to take a stance, right? That's unsportsmanlike conduct. Right, so for them to have the support to actually eject people, right, or remove people, or cancel games, or forfeit games because of unproductive behavior, right? So that's something that is a cultural thing also, right? That we accept, we make it okay for those people to act that way, and no one says anything, and they just accept it. Whereas, once you get to a point where it's, no, that's not okay. That's not the kind of behavior we want to replicate in our students. It's not the type of behavior we want to replicate in our community. But it takes people taking a stand to want to confront that. And I mean, maybe in this case, you're the first person to do that, but it is a cultural shift to move away from that. And you just have to decide on, initially, at least in the immediate situation, how you which one of the Ds you'd want to use to engage that person.
Thank you. And Melynda, I think you had something that you wanted to add to that specific question.
Yeah, so in my job, I'm the event administrator for all of our home events. And so I get the angry sport parent, especially lacrosse. And so for me, on a very practical end of it, I try to kill them with kindness. And so if they're acting really aggressively, I can't come back really aggressively, because that's just not going to be a good situation. I definitely pick and choose my battles too, though, as Dorsey was relating to, like, do I want my athletic director to walk over to the fan section with me when I'm hearing these comments? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And so you have to read the room a little bit, depending on what your role is in the situation. I mean, if this is like a high school sporting event, it could be something as simple as like, that's not cool, man. Or if it's something at Haverford College, we're going to remind them of the sportsmanship announcement that we make before every game. I may ask our SID to announce that again at halftime, or in the middle of a situation if it gets that bad. But don't go in it alone if a person is actually like physically aggressive either.
Awesome. Thank you both for those examples on how to mitigate these situations that do come up everywhere. Another question that we have is, what strategies can you recommend for becoming a disruptor or an ally without being seen as the DEI police, or being profiled and categorized as, the loudest voice, or, as Jaz mentioned earlier, that squeaky wheel that always has something to say? What kind of strategies can people do to stand up, but not be seen in a turned off sort of way?
I can answer this. Is kind of my world. So it takes a lot of relationship building, right? You have to be able to learn how to build relationships, right? So that you can make people see things individually. The concept of the meeting before the meeting, right? So if you can make people see things and get them to understand things before you get into the meeting, so that you can kind of build that consensus individually before you get into a setting where you're like, hey, you know, why don't we have more X, right? You've already built the consensus around other people and had those conversations early to do that. I mean, some people will say that that approach in particular of being more of the politically savvy may not be the best approach. Some people are when you're a disruptor, you're just a disruptor, right? You just say whatever you have to say and keep it moving. But if that's more of your niche or your preference, you're going to have to learn to be politically savvy, right? You have to know how to work the game. You have to know who the players are, right? You have to know what power dynamics are there. You have to know who makes the decision. You have to understand like systems, how they interlock with each other. It's a lot of understanding behavior, right, in people. So you have to understand like what's the best way to tell your supervisor that they are doing something wrong when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? You have to understand, and what's the best way for them to receive it from you, right? As a person that works for them, how do you tell them that, and then for them to receive it and then enact it? So I think it's a lot of learning about people and understanding people. I think it's a lot of relationship building, and I think it's really knowledge and understanding of your organization and how your organization works. But for some people, that may not be the best approach. It might be, you know, I'm just going to say it and see where it lands. And I do want to caution, because it was kind of brought up earlier. You do have to test the waters, right? What is your tolerance level? Right? Because for some people, getting fired is, you know, I'll just go find another job, right? That might be kind of hard in COVID, right? Or in certain situations of where you live. But for some people, that's a perfectly fine option. I can get fired, right? For some people, like me, I have a family, right? I have bills, student loans, right? All those things. I can't afford to necessarily get fired for certain things, right? But that doesn't mean I can't do the work, right? That doesn't mean that I can't still contribute. I still can't make change. I can't still be a disruptor. But you have to know how far you're going to push, right? Because at a certain point, yes, they may not be able to fire you for bringing up diversity, equity, inclusion, but unless you have a level of excellence, they will find another way to fire you, right? They will find another reason to let you go if they can, right? That extra lunch hour you took, right? Or those other things that they can use against you. But you have to say at a certain point, yes, I'm willing to stand up for all these things, and then just gauge where that limit is for you. For some people, there is no limit, right? They are gung-ho, I'm going to change the system no matter what. And then some people, they just, that's not reasonable for them. And there's a level of privilege that comes with that, right? The ability to do that for some people and not other people. You also have to know when it's time for you to walk away, right? Like the idea of like, they're not getting it. This is something that's important to me. This company or this organization's values don't align with my own, right? And I'm going to walk away from this because it's just not where they are at this point in time or in the foreseeable future. But that's a personal decision that you have to decide on, and how much DEI or being a disruptor in this space means to you as an individual.
Thanks. And we are a couple minutes over, but we're going to end with this last question, and this will be a fast fire round type of question. So the order, please answer in, will be Lindsay, Melynda, Jaz, and close with Dorsey. The last question is, what do you wish you knew as an undergrad student about DEI or being a disruptor?
I think for me, I said it briefly earlier, I just wish I knew more about the biases that I was walking into. I think, it's definitely a generational thing, which we've talked about. We didn't see things in certain ways. I mean, I graduated 6 years ago and different things were happening in the world then than they are now. And I think with different movements that have popped up, like the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, I'm so happy that these are coming up now and they're finally becoming on a global standpoint, because that actually is showing that these biases are out there. And when I was graduating, some of these things weren't out there and they weren't, shown, or they were hidden, or they wanted to hide us from these things. And I think that was the toughest part for me, was going into this giant corporation, this giant hotel, and not having an idea of what it was going to be like. I just thought if I did a good job, then I was going to be recognized. But, you know, sometimes you are that small fish in a big pond. And I was in a place that had hundreds of employees and hundreds of managers. And how can I actually step up when I did feel a different way about things? And I finally was getting my eyes opened because I could see all these things happening around me that no one necessarily prepared you for. And so I think nowadays, I'm happy that these movements are coming out and these biases are being talked about, because that is something that I think is going to better prepare any student for the real world in that career.
Yeah, to go off of what Lindsay said, I think for me, I wish I knew how privileged I was and was able to better situations for other people because of that privilege. I appreciate how much everything is talked about now, because I realized just 4 years ago when I graduated, we had one class about diversity in our education at Temple. And so I took an African American Studies class, but it was a gen ed. And honestly, it was one of those classes that fit my schedule and it was a choice. And so I wish that people, as an undergraduate, expanded those gen eds to actually learn about things and not just pick things that are good for their schedule. I had people of color in my life for always. And so to me, it wasn't a big deal, but it is a big deal. And now I wish I had known that a little bit more during an undergrad. And I think that has given me a bigger appreciation to speaking up right now in my workplace and in my personal life about, you know, the Black Lives Matter movement and all of the anti-Black racism that's happening. And so I just wish I knew how much I didn't know, which, you know, how are you ever going to know that? But you asked me what I wish, so that's it.
I agree with both of you so far. I mean, it fascinates me that how I could be so naive to discrimination, considering that, like, when I was in Temple, my mantra was diversity, inclusion, sharing stories, but like I had no idea about like the negative side of things with discrimination and people treating you differently based off of what you look like in your gender and all of those sorts of things. Like I don't know how I didn't have a clue, but I didn't have a clue until it was happening in the work world. So I think having courses or having internships where there are questions about biases in the workplace so that students are actually examining it and can process it before they're out there.
I think wrapping up, I had two things. So I in line with what Jaz said, I think Temple does, at least when I was there, it does create an opportunity that spoils you, right? Because it's a predominantly white institution, but at least at the time I was there, it was extremely diverse, right? I think we were like 20% Black or 18% Black or something. That was just Black population, not accounting for all the other races and ethnic groups, right? So for me, my experience at a PWI is vastly different than the average student at a PWI, right? That goes to a PWI. So the idea of not having professors of color, that's like foreign to me, right? Something as simple as that is like, for students at Florida State, that was like a dream, right? To have a Black professor in the class was like, that was not their norm, right? So I think that was one part, is I wish how privileged I was to have that experience at the time, to be able to have those professors and those mentors. I'm learning that as I get older and starting to see that that really is not the norm. And then I wish I had taken more advantages of global experiences or international experiences, right? To see how different people and of different backgrounds and different faiths and all those things operate on a global scale. I think that's sometimes a lot of things that's something that's lacking, I think, in my experience until more recent, until I got older and professionally and started to travel a lot more. But I wish I took advantage of study abroad or a service learning trip abroad or something to that effect when I was at Temple, to expand my global perspective of particularly oppression and anti-Blackness and all those things. And I think those would have created that experience for me.
Okay, well, I will wrap it up for now. Thank you so much again to the panelists for being here today. Just to everybody who's still on, just a reminder that if you aren't subscribing to any of Mac's amazing social media platforms or any of the newsletters, do so, because you get so many cool updates. Their next event, or our next event, excuse me, is on the 6th with Melynda, who's here as well, will be on this, about what happens next and about transitioning from scholar to business professionals. So just put that in your schedules now. You make sure you can register. Thanks again for everybody who's in attendance today, and feel free just to enjoy the rest of your day. Stay safe, and looking forward to seeing you guys at our next event.